Hello and welcome to Transfermarkt TV. I'm Manuel, he's Stefan Bienkowski, and we're back finally after a very long and strenuous week of transfer deadlines and deals. And it's fun to be back, Stefan. And we have something really big to discuss, and that's Jadon Sancho. He's one of the players that didn't move, although there were some brief rumors that he could leave Manchester United and go to Saudi Arabia, which is, of course, a topic that we have filed for later this week. But let's talk about Jadon Sancho. Arrived with so much promise from Borussia Dortmund at Manchester United. We all agree that he's a very talented player, and it just isn't working there. There's now reports that Man United are trying to offload him again in January. It's fallen out with manager Erik Ten Hag. Stefan, what's the latest here?
Yeah, there's lots of reports that he's having these showdown discussions with Erik Ten Hag. They're always showdown, they're always dramatic, they're always conclusive, which seems a little bizarre to me since we're not in the middle of a transfer window. So no matter what happens, the pair of them are stuck with each other at least for another couple of months. I think Sancho's a very interesting topic at Man United. I think he's, a very hot topic for Man United fans. As you said, he joined the club with a lot of fanfare, a huge amount of expectation considering the kind of drawn-out transfer saga that it took to sign him. And I think since he joined the club, I think he has kind of gone on to kind of embody the struggles that Man United have had in putting together a coherent football team. Not to mention the fact that they've had one head coach after another who's come in with different systems, different formations, different roles for these players. And I think Sancho's perhaps one of the most obvious ones who's really struggled to kind of swim with the tide or swim against the tide, whatever you want to use the expression. And what I mean by that is that it's these outside factors that seem to have had a huge part in whether he's thrived or not at Man United. And you only really have to look at the stats to not only show where his game has perhaps changed compared to what he did at Dortmund, but also perhaps to kind of underline the kind of narrative around him, the kind of media speculation, and perhaps even his manager's opinion of him are actually a little different from what he has offered on the pitch over the last kind of 2 and a bit seasons. If I was to kind of look at his last 2 seasons at Dortmund, for example, which I have open in front of me, and they really show us not only a rising star, but a player who really thrived in the Bundesliga. We're talking about a player who, was third for total shots amongst Dortmund players over those last 2 seasons, second for passes in the opposition half, first for assists, and first for key passes. And so, you put it all together, and we're talking about a player here who's scored a lot of goals, created a lot of assists, but was obviously kind of the main man at Borussia Dortmund. And then if you kind of look at his time at Man United, if we kind of focus on those first 2 seasons, so it's a comparable time difference between that and his Dortmund time. And there are some stats that are very similar, and there's some stats that are very different, which I find really fascinating, to be honest with you. For example, it may come as a surprise to Man United fans to learn that over the 2-season stretch, he was actually second in Man United squad for key passes. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, a key pass is a metric, and it's just a term we use for a pass that leads to a shot. So basically, an assist that wasn't an assist, if you will. Second amongst the entire Man United squad, only behind Bruno Fernandes, who was really far and away in that stat. But the fact that he was second, I think, is quite telling. Fifth for assists, which I think is also quite telling. Fifth for successful crosses. But when you kind of filter out the fullbacks who kind of feature quite heavily in that, he was second again, only behind Fernandes. Third for passes in the opposition half. Fifth for assists, and fourth for goals, which I find really fascinating. And actually, if you look at his goal contributions over those first 2 seasons, he actually only finishes fourth behind Bruno Fernandes, again top, Marcus Rashford, who's second, and then Cristiano Ronaldo, who's third, who obviously had that fantastic goal scoring season at Man United before he left. But way ahead of the likes of Martial, who had 9 compared to Sanchez's 15, Eriksen, who had 8, and then Casemiro actually comes in with 7th. But even if you want to compare him to other kind of wingers, Anthony, for example, has only managed to pick up 6 goal contributions since he joined the club. So we're talking about a player here who perhaps hasn't done as well as he did at Dortmund, but is still somehow, some way, actually one of Man United's most potent attacking players when it comes to creating chances, scoring goals, and of course creating goals, particularly in terms of assists. His game type or game style certainly has changed, but it's as if he still is picking up decent stats in a very convoluted Man United team. And I think it is quite interesting that he's the one who's kind of picked on, at least in terms of the reports to suggest what the reports suggest, as being this kind of great underperformer when, compared to a lot of the other wingers in that squad over the last kind of couple of seasons, he's actually outperformed many of them.
I feel like we are kind of unpicking an urban myth here a little bit, Stefan, in terms of what's going on with Jadon Sancho. So if his numbers are good, why is there such an issue? And I mean, I saw the statements that were put out, and we all know how clubs brief the press, right, about certain things. We all know where this is coming from. And I almost sense that there was a little bit of a character assassination happening here when it comes to Jadon Sancho. What is the issue here? If his underlying numbers are strong, why isn't it working at Man United?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's worth pointing out that while they're strong compared to Man United's other wide players or wingers, they're not particularly impressive in the Premier League as a whole. He's not great compared to Mohamed Salah or Bernardo Silva or whoever Chelsea's playing on the wings these days. Maybe better than Mudryk, actually, I mentioned it. But on the whole, he's still some way off what he should be doing, and there's no doubt about that. I think the point that's worth making is that in this really dysfunctional team that has seen a huge amount of upheaval over the last kind of, since he's joined the club, I think they're on their third or fourth head coach, for example, and I think that's the key thing here. He might have fitted into an Ole Gunnar Solskjaer team who kind of has some idea that he was obviously coming in. Ralf Rangnick may have tried to make him work if he stayed on long term, but obviously Erik Ten Hag has arrived and he's really imposed his own kind of transfer policy on the club. Obviously a huge focus on players from the Eredivisie. Perhaps the most obvious player is Antony, who plays in a very similar position as him, and some would say probably has a more favoured view from his head coach in regards to starting, despite the fact that his own output has actually struggled, and even in comparison to Sancho's. So I think that's probably the main thing here. I think when Sancho has had a chance to play, I think it's also worth noting one of the most interesting stats I noticed is that over those 2 seasons, he was top of Man United's squad for the amount of times he was subbed off amongst the entire squad. So he hasn't really had a great run of it. I think Man United fans would be happy to point out that, he hasn't had a great run in terms of starting games as well. And it just kind of feels as though he hasn't really had an opportunity to prove himself. And perhaps the fact that the current head coach, Erik Ten Hag, has inherited a squad and maybe he labelled him very immediately as saying, well, that's a player who hasn't performed in the last 2 seasons prior to me joining, so I don't have a huge amount of faith in him. I think the only thing that could maybe rescue Sancho over the course of this coming season is the fact that obviously there's a huge amount of disruption in the squad right now. Obviously Greenwood has moved on. We're still not sure what Antony's future at the club is, and if both those players have kind of no longer, started for Man United, there is an opportunity there for Sancho to kind of slot in wide. And I think the other thing that might really help him, and it's something that he hasn't really had over those first 2 seasons, is that they've also picked up Rasmus Højlund. And, we're talking about finally an actual clear number 9 in that team that Sancho can play off, which was such a huge part of his game at Dortmund. And he just simply didn't have that over the last kind of couple of seasons. Of course, Ronaldo was there, but, it's very well catalogued that he wasn't the most mobile player when he was playing up front for Man United. And when it wasn't Ronaldo, it was Rashford, who, even if he was played up front as a number 9, he often drifted out wide anyways. So Højlund could be the kind of missing piece there that could maybe get the best out of Sancho. But yeah, we'll have to kind of wait and see what happens.
So I guess then the final question before we wrap this up, what's next?
Yeah, it's a very good question. There's a huge, as always, and I think it's kind of defined Sancho's kind of tenure at Man United. There's a lot of mitigating factors that may play in his hand or out of his hand. I mentioned the fact that certain personnel on the team might not be playing going forward. And of course, whether he can slot in there instead and build up some sort of partnership with Højlund. That's the kind of thing that could rescue his Man United career. But reports in England certainly suggest that Ten Hag is more or less fed up with him right now. So you never know what's going to happen. But at the very least, like I said at the start of this video, they're stuck with each other for at least the next 2 or 3 months. So you'd hope that they try and make it work between now and the January transfer window.
Yeah, it's an interesting story that we, of course, going to keep an eye on. And of course, you can follow it too on Transfermarkt, whether you want to discuss it in the forums, whether you want to check it out in the rumor mills, see what clubs Jadon Sancho may be linked to. I'm pretty sure over the next couple of months, there will be many. And so, yeah, stay up to date on Transfermarkt, whether it's on.com, .us, or .co.uk. We always have the latest news for you. We'll be back soon with more content. Until then, cheers and bye-bye.